those just joining us in the back, please take a seat. Greetings and welcome to the International Studies Policy Forum. We welcome UCI students, faculty, community members to this evening's presentation titled Genocide, Sudan. I'm Professor Sarah Goodman from Political Science. Thank you for joining us for what I'm sure will be a remarkable and unforgettable evening. In addition to international studies and, of course, Living Ubuntu, this program is sponsored by the Institute for International, Global, and Regional Studies, as well as the Interdisciplinary Center for the Scientific Study of Ethics and Morality. To introduce this evening's program of events, I'd like to bring up Barbara English, founder and director of Living Ubuntu. Ms. English is a licensed marriage family therapist and certified bioenergetic therapist with over 20 years' experience in psychotherapy. Working from a mind-body perspective, she utilizes relational somatic methods as part of the healing process for those seeking recovery after abuse or trauma. She states that upon recognizing that current Western models of recovery are grossly inadequate for addressing the pervasiveness of traumatized societies locally and globally, in 2005 she founded Living Ubuntu and serves as its volunteer executive director. Living Ubuntu, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly because I've done it like 7 times already in this talk, seeks to increase compassion and support for the common good. Its efforts include raising awareness of trauma while offering methods of recovery better suited to large numbers of people from a variety of cultures. With that, please help me in giving a warm welcome to Ms. English.
So happy to be with you today, and within your program, the first thing I want to draw your attention to when you get one is to look for this card inside, because at the end of the program we're going to give you an invitation to participate in something if you'd like to. We have an exhibit at the back, and if you would like to write a note on this to express how today's program impacted you in any way that suits you, we're taking cards on the back there as part of commemorating the survivors and the victims of genocide. So throughout the month of April, we've been putting on a film series. There's 6 film events plus a closing reception. And today is actually event number 4. We've done this at 6 different campuses, or by the end of April, we will have done it at 6 different campuses. And so the genocides that are being commemorated within the film series are genocides that have commemorative dates within the month of April. There are many, many more genocides than what we're featuring here, but these are genocides that actually started during the month of April. So the intention of the film series is to raise awareness of genocide, of these various genocides, of the pervasiveness of genocide, but also to increase awareness of how many refugees we have living in Southern California and how many of them are actually survivors of genocide. And also as a psychotherapist, I'm always looking to raise awareness of the fact that the suffering doesn't end at the end of a genocide, that there are traumatic experiences for the people that go through a genocide and survive. And those experiences color the experiences that their children have and that their children have. So there's transgenerational trauma as well as the firsthand experience of trauma. So within that, let me tell you, well, one more thing about your program, if you have it by now. In addition to this card in here, the black and white insert is all about today, so film synopsis and speakers, but this color cover has information on all of the events. So if you want to join us next week in Long Beach for the Bosnia event, or the Chapman event the week after that on the Holocaust, or I would invite you to please consider coming and joining us at the closing reception end of the month, where we're going to develop some dialogues about a lot of different issues. All the information for all of the events is in here. So quickly about the program today. As soon as I'm done up here, we're going to show you some film clips And the sequence of them, they will cover some of the issues that have been going on in Darfur. And after that, we have film clips that are about the Nuba Mountains. And after that, we have film clips that are about South Sudan and specifically about the very recent conflict that's erupted in South Sudan beginning December 15th of last year. After we show you the film clips, I'm going to bring up 4 speakers and introduce them to you. Each one's going to give you a brief talk. And then for the remainder of the program, hoping we can just engage everyone in the room in some dialogue around these issues. So hoping for discussion, questions. You know, if you have questions of the speakers, that's fine. If you have questions about the films, that's fine too. Wherever you want to take it is fine with me, within certain parameters. Should never say that in a college class. But, okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the film clips. I should have mentioned when I gave the introduction that this is the only one of the 6 film series events that we're doing this month that has to do with genocide ongoing and present day. And that influenced our selection choice. We wanted to show you some things that are current rather than you know, a full-length documentary which might have been more out of date. So now I want to introduce the speakers, and I'm gonna read the bios for all 4 of them at once, and they're gonna all come up at once, and then we'll hear a little bit from each one of them, and then after that, like I said, we'll open it up to questions from you and have a dialogue here. So first, Joseph Jock, if you wanna. Do you guys want to just all come up and take your seats? And I'll introduce you from up here. Joseph Jock is a resettlement supervisor in the San Diego office of the International Rescue Committee, a leading humanitarian organization with over 20 offices in the United States, doing relief work in over 40 countries around the world. Mr. Jock, born in Congors, South Sudan, came to the U.S. as a refugee in 1998. Immediately upon arrival, he became involved in the local Sudanese community activities and took a leading role in organizing a nascent Sudanese community in San Diego. As community public relation liaison, Mr. Jock published articles and was interviewed by major newspapers in Southern California. He also oversaw and organized the 2011 South Sudan referendum activities, which include voters' education, registration, and the driving to polling stations in Phoenix. Mr. Jock began his career as a large animal veterinary practitioner in a small town in Libya after graduating from veterinary medicine school in Alexandria, Egypt. 3 years after that, his first career job in Libya, he became a refugee in Egypt. While in Egypt, he became involved in local community organization activities. He attended and organized several community development workshops in collaboration with regional organizations such as the Near East Foundation, the Sudan Development Initiative abroad. Since 2009, Mr. Jock has visited South Sudan several times and attended South Sudan Independence's celebration in July 9, 2011. He holds a Bachelor's of Veterinary Medical Science from University of Alexandria, Egypt, and Master's degree in International Relations from Alliant. Sitting next to Joseph is Julima. She was born in Omdurman, Sudan. At the age of 4, she and members of her family moved to Cairo, Egypt as in-city refugees. Ms. Julima has lived in the United States since she was 7 years old. She and her family were resettled into San Diego, California. Members of her extended family, present day, reside in the Nuba Mountains of South Kordofan. She's a recent graduate of La Jolla Country Day School and since graduating has taken a gap year to pursue her community activism and writing. Several of Ms. Julima's literary works can be found in publications like the International Rescue Committee, the Global Journal Project, and most recently, Border Voices. When she returns to school, she plans to study chemical engineering and biochemistry. Next to Julia sits Katie J. Scott. Did anyone manage to see Camp Darfur out in the plaza today, the 6 refugee tents? Okay, that's Katie J. responsible for those tents out there, and a few volunteers in the room too, from her organization. Katie J. is the Director of Operations and Community Involvement of IACT, an organization of communities of people creating a new culture of participation, offering new ways to connect with and support those who are affected by mass atrocities. Ms. Scott coordinates partnerships with other grassroots organizations and implements the IACT campaigns. She graduated from Portland State University with a BA in sociology and a focus on community development. She's previously worked as a community organizer in Thailand, Guatemala, and with grassroots organizations across the U.S. She co-founded the Portland Coalition for Genocide Awareness with other grassroots activists in November 2005. Has been part of the IACT team since July of 2007. She's visited the Chad-Darfur border region 5 times and coordinated several campaigns and IACT partnerships. She works to bring the voices of refugees to the world conscience. And last but not least, on the end there is Martina Nee, who happens to be Treasurer, Secretary, and Director of Living Ubuntu, one of our beloved board members. She's also the Executive Director of San Francisco Bay Area Darfur Coalition. She's a 2009 Carl Wilkins Fellow and serves on the advisory boards for the Carl Wilkins Fellowship and UC Berkeley School of Law Human Rights Center. She's participated and organized numerous lobby efforts for Darfur, Sudan anti-genocide strategies on Capitol Hill, the U.S. State Department, California Legislature, and the City and County of San Francisco. She is co-chair of the International Human Rights Portfolio and Task Force on Israel, World Jewry, and International Human Rights of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. She's a member of the Jewish Community Relations Council of San Francisco, a recipient of JCRC's 2008 Honorable Tom Lantos Memorial Humanitarian Award. She previously practiced corporate and securities law for over 20 years, earned her JD from UC Berkeley of Law and BA from UC Berkeley. So we can welcome them all. And now we're going to begin with each one of them giving you a brief talk. I want you to know, I asked them to tell you from a personal perspective, and the theme of the day is we're really trying to keep the theme on the actual people and what they go through during a genocide. So beginning with Joseph, if you want to come on up here.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you all. First, we should have warned you about the gravity of the video. I think there's a lot of very graphics. And I know many of you are IR students would be interested in knowing, or any other person, why this is happening. I'm not going to tell you about why it's happening. There's not one reason to explain the whole things that is happening. But I want to talk to you about what happened to me personally. I was born and raised in South Sudan, and some of the cities that were shown in the video that you saw, that's where I came from. I live in Bor town and Malakal. I was born in Bor, and I went to school in Malakal. And in late 80s, when the war started in South Sudan, I was in probably in high school, and I was in Malakal town. Malakal was a besieged town, was a government garrison, but it was under frequent attacks by the South Sudanese rebel or SPLA. At that time, it was not easy for me to stay in Malakal. First, I left my family, my mom, in another city, a small town. So I went in pursuit of education to Malakal. But Malakal was insecure. Every day, person is missing. To the last day when I was in Malakal, probably I was in high school with one of my best friends. And one day, I was supposed to be with him. He left, he went to the city because we were in boarding school. But there is a distance you cross from the city to the boarding school. When he was coming back, he was gone. We looked over for 3 days. We didn't know where he was. After 3 days, his mutilated body was found. And when I remember that incident, it continued to traumatize me. And I even sometimes feel, why did I survive? Because a very close friend of mine that I lived with him for so many years. And then I decided to go to northern part of Sudan. And I went to school there in a school called Rufa. Then in high school, my only hope is just to, do everything trying to forget what is happening and excel in school so that I can go to another place. So I focus my attention in school, although every day I hear a lot of news, atrocity happening back home. But I continue to focus on my studies. So I was able to get a scholarship to go and study in Egypt. After several years in Egypt, the war continued in South Sudan until when I graduated from veterinary medicine school. And my hope was to go back, and as coming from the background of tribe of Dinka tribe, they are pastoralists and Agrarian, and I wanted to help practice and improve their livestock. But that dream was not possible again because of the conflict in South Sudan. So I decided to go to another country. I went to Libya, and that's when first I practiced veterinary medicine in Libya. But Libya also, at that time, there was sanction of the embargo because of the bombing of Pan Am in Lockerbie. So President Muammar Gaddafi was being sanctioned. So there was no flights. And even it's become more difficult. You work and you don't get paid. So I was forced again to go back to Egypt. I became a refugee in Egypt. I stayed there until when I came to the United States in 1998 as a refugee through the United Nations. So this is like, my life, and through all this one, I went through a lot. But the most tormenting things that I see is when I see all these things happening again. One of the statements that our president, Salva Kiir, said, I was in the same, stadium when he was delivering his message for the independence of South Sudan. And he said, our people will never cross to border again for such a peace and security. I wish he was right. Many people have said that. Even our President Barack Obama, when he was candidate, seeing a lot of things happening, he would say, never again in our watch. Those things are still happening. It always tormented me. Why is that happening? And for the latest conflicts, it's directly affected me. And you see Board Town, the place where the patient were killed in the hospital. My entire family live in that city. They have to move, and I have to send a lot of money for them to go to Uganda. And my aunt was elderly. She was not able to flee the conflict, but she was killed, elderly blind. So that was like some of the worst things that are happening, and always people wondering why. And I'm not, later on, if you guys have a question, we can talk about why, in particular in South Sudan, why this is happening. But in short, this is my story and how it's is always like difficult thing when things that supposed not happen, they keep happening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joseph. Come on up, Julie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. It's a very intense subject, but it's under the auspices of prevention and awareness. So for that, I'll gladly sit here and watch some really intense films. My story differs from Joseph Jock's because for me, I was born during wartime, and I'm a little bit removed in terms of images like this still move me and shock me, but people, my parents' generation, it's so normal for them to see things like that. And my family's from the Nuba Mountains, which there was quite the expose on, and specifically from the mountains we're in the Irvine region, and within that region we're the Moro tribe. And just so you guys know, the Nuba Mountains is a huge area. It's not like it's one ethnic group. It's many different, several hundred ethnic groups that are in this region, and it's identified as the Nuba Mountains. And for me, it was interesting to see that a lot of the films, the year that they were made was 2012, and I distinctly remember that year because it was my junior year of high school. And apart from that just being a crazy year to be in high school, it was a really intense year for my family, and every other week it seemed there was someone who I had grown up with that had taken care of me, who was my mother's sister, my mother's cousin, and back home cousins are like first brothers. There's not very much of a distinction between cousins and brothers and uncles and aunts. And it seemed like every other week, we heard about someone passing away. And hearing about all this for me kind of led me into writing, and I brought a few pieces to share with you guys. I know we're under a time crunch, so I promise I'll keep it short. But here's my first piece. Black skin, black limbs, black eyes, black whims, black life filled with proverbs and adages. Our lives build stories no one will hear. Children of yellow-eyed men who know not sleep without demons, soothed by golden-tongued goddesses. This is Sudanese America, where they wake their demons when they see the Nile reflected in children's eyes, because children are the everything they know nothing about. And I wrote this piece after talking to my mom, and it's awesome to get to talk to her. We talk in the kitchen while we're cooking. I don't get to talk to my dad as often because he doesn't really like to cook. But being in the kitchen with my mom is absolutely amazing, and with cooking, I get to learn more about her life, and it's just now that it's become easier for her to share with me because, as you guys see, there's some serious things that they haven't even dealt with yet, and it's crazy to try to raise a family, let alone 4 crazy kids that are all very independent. But one of the stories she told me was of her young cousin. She was about 18 years old, and her cousin was pregnant, and my mother had to watch her cousin's stomach being mutilated, and she described very vividly how the unborn child fell out from the womb. And these are the things, just to think that these are the things that my parents are carrying around that we don't get to hear about. And that's what this poem, this piece that I just read to you came from. My next piece, I wrote a little bit more recently. It's called Birthday Text. I wrote it a few weeks ago on my birthday. The night blanketed my skin, steering my course were 2 wholesome diamonds. I was born with more than most, on an even day, in an even month during the rainy season. I was a blessing that began blossom in wartime. On the anniversary of my first day of life, the rain welcomes me, and my mother smiles the covenant. And for me, this piece was a turning point, and not just because it was written on my birthday, but because this was really the first year where I understood what it means to be children who are born in such a chaotic state, whose sense of normalcy is absolutely thwarted, who come from parents whose ideal of normalcy is absolutely fragmented, and to try to make something of that and to be the ones to really speak on their behalf, it's a great honor, because I know that they right now cannot do this, but soon enough they'll be the ones to share those firsthand accounts. And that's what that piece was. My last piece I wrote a while ago, I think like 2 years ago, when my mom and I kind of had our first exchange in this now series of exchanges that have led to lots of different writings, and it's called The Village Boy. I am the Nubian maid, raw, vegan, vulgar, with molten molasses sugared skin. And he was a village boy with stars as eyes and trees as limbs. He was a village boy with hose as hands, a style of indigenous brands, and I loved him the way warm air loves cold air. A beautiful tango, waltz throwing mangoes, and suspended midair, we found that warmth is a color you feel. A summer sunset during winter, all the songs and every star, suspended midair, we found that warmth is a color you feel, but they came. The hunters of lions, they came and threw a metal arrow to his back, an attack as stark as red on cotton. Thank you.
My name's Katie J, and I come to you not as a survivor of genocide, but as an advocate for genocide survivors and for all of us to stand up as advocates. I first learned about what's happening in Darfur in a similar situation as this. I was a sociology student at PSU, and I was taking Foundations of Sociology, which is probably the most boring sociology class you can take. And my professor at the time said, instead of learning about a bunch of dead white guys who had these great theories that none of them are actually being practiced, we're going to go and listen to something, about something that's very real. And Ruth Messenger from the American Jewish World Service was on campus, and she had just visited the refugee camps in eastern Chad, the refugee camps that I now work in. And she put a picture of a young child up. She was going through a series of slides, and this young girl had bright orange hair. She was an African child, and she had bright orange hair. And she said the reason that this girl has orange hair is because she's severely malnourished, and she's never been nourished in her entire life. She was probably 4 or 5. And it was at that point that she spoke that really hit me that this was the same thing that happened to the Rwandans. And I was in high school at that time. Remember doing a project on what was happening, remember knowing the evidence, seeing it, sharing it, and then walking away and continuing on with my life. And I also remember it was a similar situation to what happened during the Holocaust. And I remember being in my world geography class, learning about the Holocaust and saying to myself, if I was alive during the Holocaust, I would have done something. I would have passed out flyers. I would have handed, tried to pass food through the ghetto, one of the concentration camps. I would have done something. And so as Ruth Messenger was speaking about the situation in Darfur, I realized that was my moment to stand up instead of stand by. And since then, my organization does a lot of grassroots organizing. I work with a lot of students just like you. And we go to the refugee camps in eastern Chad, and we do projects that the refugees want themselves. They approach our organization and say, we'd like to have preschool education, we would like to have peace education, we would like to do sports to help in our own trauma recovery. And that's part of what my organization does, is try to help those who have been affected by mass atrocities move forward by acknowledging what's happened to them, by that they have been targeted because of who they are, and giving them the tools to rebuild. One interesting thing about the films was Salva Kiir and his generation of leaders, when the conflict started between the North and the South, when they were still one country, they were just young children, and now they're full-grown adult leaders, but they never had any other education besides the education of the weapon. So when things started to not go well as a government in South Sudan, the only tool that they had, the only tool that they knew was the one of war. And it's not their fault that that's the only tool that they knew, but the international community spent a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort on getting the ballots right and making sure that everybody could get registered. And we skipped the process where we talk about peace and reconciliation. We skipped that. And now you see the same thing happening that's been happening for decades and decades and decades, which is the perpetrators going in and using weapons as a way to move forward instead of tools for peace. So my first thing I want you to take away is that we have to invest in peace for the next generation. We have to begin reconciliation by acknowledging what has happened and offering them ways to live as one community, not as adversarial communities. And that does begin with young children. It does begin by taking them when we're raw and we're ready to take on the world, and when we're, when we're flexible and when we're open to ideas. That peace education needs to begin. The second thing I want you to take away is that what's happening now as an advocacy community, this is the first time ever that there's been an anti-genocide movement while a genocide and while mass atrocities are still occurring. After the Holocaust, after Cambodia, after Rwanda and Bosnia and Guatemala, Cambodia, the world said and acknowledged after, oh my God, we let people be killed just because of who they are. We stood by and we had the evidence, but we didn't know we didn't know what to do. And okay, we promise never again, we won't let it happen. We won't let people be killed just because of who they are. And then it occurred again and again and again. And so the movement to end the genocide in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains is the first time where people are standing up while the genocide is still going on. And that movement started by students just like you. It started in a dorm room, and that led to an organization, Genocide Intervention Network, and it led to a whole network of grassroots communities across the United States. So as students and as community advocates, we have the power to change the way the world responds to genocide. Way back when, nobody thought we could end slavery. And there is still human trafficking, but people don't own slaves anymore. And so one day, my hope is, by coming together as a community of advocates, we can end modern day genocide, and we can end people being targeted because of their race, their religion, or their ethnicity. So, and you can be part of that movement. So as individuals, we can take forward peace through our own actions and peace through tools for peace for communities like Joseph's and Julia's.
Hi, my name is Martina Nee, and I'm going to talk to you about my experiences, what is called a second-generation genocide survivor, which I think is somewhat more of a label than I deserve, so to speak. My mother is the genocide survivor. So I was born in Vienna, Austria. My parents are both born and raised in Vienna, Austria. They were both medical doctors. And the three of us came to the United States in 1956. And I just want to emphasize that I went to great schools. I have two loving parents. I was not impoverished. I did not suffer physically, but my mother led an extremely traumatized life, and her effect on me was quite devastating, and that is really what I want to share with you, that the effects of a genocide do not end when the genocide is over. The effects go on for generations, and perhaps even in the absence of future generations. So my mother, and I'll go very quickly, was 13 when Hitler and the Nazis came to power in Germany. She was 18 when government-sponsored violence began in Austria, and particularly in Vienna, where she lived. And during those 5 preceding years were all of the gradual restrictions on society, wearing a gold star, not being allowed to go to public parks, closing of Jewish businesses, Jewish children being restricted to certain schools, etc. And in 1939, when my mother was 19, her mother committed suicide. Her mother was Jewish and did not practice Judaism and did not consider herself Jewish and did not teach her children anything about being Jewish because she thought it was too dangerous. And my mother believes the reason she committed suicide is that if she were not there as a link to Judaism, that her 3 children would be safer. And at approximately the same time, my mother's maternal grandparents both committed suicide on the day that they were spit upon in their own store. And one uncle of my mother's just completely disappeared. Nobody ever had any idea what happened to him. And another uncle also committed suicide. And when my mother was also a teenager leading up to that time and also during that time, she watched from her own window at home her friends being taken away in carts that later they learned those carts went to trains, and those trains went to labor camps and concentration camps. But nobody knew where they were going at the time, but everyone knew to do absolutely nothing to interfere or stop them or protest. And my maternal grandfather was Catholic. And I don't know this for a fact. I was never told anything, but I am very afraid that the only reason my mother and her sister survived the war in Vienna is because their father, my grandfather, was tight with the Nazis in terms of being able to get food, keep them in school, being able to stay in their home, etc., etc. And even though physically safe, my mother was by no means emotionally or mentally safe. Late in the war, the Nazis started drafting half-Jews. There's no such thing, but the Nazis made a category of half-Jews. So my mother's little brother, who was Jewish, was drafted into the Nazi army and was killed on a train that was bombed by the Americans. And my mother was 24 years old when she had to identify his body. When she was 25 years old, and the Russians were the first to liberate Austria, she was gang raped by Russian soldiers and contracted syphilis and had to be treated in secret, basically, because in those days, nice girls did not get syphilis. And she was married at the time and never told her husband about it. And that was her first husband, not my father. And so as you can see, my mother was even though she lived through this horrific genocide, she was incredibly traumatized. And my father, who was Catholic but really lived as an adult, as an atheist, was drafted into the Nazi army. And he never, ever, ever spoke about it, not once. And I just can't even imagine. And obviously, he was not a Nazi. And my father died when I was 10, and I was an only child, and so I was very, very, very close to my mother. And her many, many emotional and mental and spiritual problems affected me greatly and long into my adulthood and still affect me. But perhaps the biggest one is that I never knew I was Jewish until after my mother died. And my mother never practiced Judaism. She never identified herself as a Jew. She did say to me that Hitler identified her as a half-Jew. I never asked what that meant, and I basically didn't ask questions because we didn't ask questions, and Holocaust survivors didn't volunteer easily about the war. And so I have no idea why. I wanted my mother to be buried with a Jewish burial service, and so a rabbi was found who would perform the service, and I went to speak with him in, of course, absolute shock about my mother's death. And he wanted to know about my mother, so I told him some of the story that I told you, and by way of apology, even though my husband is Jewish and we had been married in the temple, I said that, I've never converted. And he looked at me as if I were crazy and said, "Why would you convert? You are Jewish." And that instant in my life was so huge, even though I was in complete shock about my mother's death. It was the first time in my life that I ever felt I belonged to anything except my mother and father, and I understood I had a heritage. And when I first learned about the genocide in Darfur in 2004, it was also through AJWS on its website. The first thing I said, and I still think about it almost every day, is if there is one child who I can save from any kind of effect similar to mine, I want to do it. And that is what I try to do. Thank you.
Thank you to all four of you so much. At this point, we want to open it up to questions from you, and I just realized we don't actually have a microphone on the panel. Will they be able to hear them okay, do you think? Or? Oh, one right there. Okay. So you guys can pass that around. Okay. Does anyone have a question for anyone on the panel? Back there, yeah.
I personally find this subject to be, I find it to be very, I would like to get involved with it in the future. What would you suggest to the youth and to people that want to help with the cause and that simply would like to get involved with it? Okay, Jay, you want to take over?
Well, it's really easy to get involved. It really depends on the level of involvement that you're seeking. I always encourage people to be, first and foremost, 5-minute a month activists. There are an abundance of websites that you can sign up on their email list and get, like Nuba Reports, for instance, they release videos, sometimes if it's heavy attacks, they'll release, 3 or 4 videos in a week. They'll do finer tuned videos, every month, something like that. Nuba Reports is a great idea. Martina and I are co-founders of Act for Sudan. You can go on that website. It's a coalition of 76 Sudanese and American organizations working to change U.S. policy. There's a lot of tangible actions that you can do, including like Facebook actions and petitions, email petitions, phone calls to the White House, so very tangible things. If you want to do more locally, Living Ubuntu is always looking for volunteers here in Orange County, and they do tremendous work with the Southern Sudanese and other refugees population living in Southern California and San Diego, where Joseph and Julia are from, and they do a lot of trauma recovery, but then they also do a lot of events like these where coming and helping even just pass out the programs or set up Camp Darfur, that's a great way to start your education and make an impact locally. And then from there, if you wanted to get more involved as in going over to the refugee camps or going to refugee camps in any part of the world who have experienced mass atrocities, that's a different level at which you can get involved in. But I really encourage you to at least sign up on email, get on email lists and take the actions. There's constant actions going on. All of us are on Facebook. You can find us and follow us. We post all sorts of different actions that you can take.
Next question?
Maybe it's just me, but I feel like our generation has become really complacent with issues not just abroad, but just issues even on our own campus. Do you have any speculation as to why or what we can do about this?
Well, I think every generation at your age probably feels like that. I think that when I was a student at Portland State and we came together to co-found the Portland Coalition for Genocide Awareness, I was the only student. Everybody else was older. They'd been in Amnesty International for a long time. And so I think everybody feels that frustration. I think the easiest thing to do to combat that is to get involved and be active. And you can be just as active as when you guys go out to dinner tonight with your friends, or you go out to drinks, this coming Friday night, you just bring it up in conversation. Hey, I heard survivors of genocide speak this week. Did you know that something was going on in Sudan? And simply bringing that up in conversation will raise the consciousness of your friends and of yourself. And then you can slowly get more and more involved. A great thing that you guys have that we didn't have when we were younger is social media. I mean, there was no Facebook when I was in high school. There was no Twitter, and everybody is always on their phones. So you can always use that as a way to reach out to your friends. Snap a photo right now, post on Instagram, use the hashtag #ActToEndGenocide. April is Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month, and all across the country, students and adults are going to events like these, and they're all using the same hashtag, And then once maybe your friend sees that you're using that hashtag, that you're at an event, and they search under that hashtag on Twitter, and they get more involved. So I wouldn't be frustrated by the feeling of complacency. I think that, the human brain is not fully developed until you're 26 years old. So you're not, that's why you should not have kids until you're 26. But, so the evolution of the human mind is in itself very self-absorbent until you raise your own consciousness. So like I have a 2-year-old and she's like totally self-absorbed, right? And like as she gets a little bit older, she'll kind of move forward in her consciousness. And as people get older, you become, the highest level is somebody like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi, or we all strive to be that. But let's be real, we're more at like level 3 and level 4. But you start to think outside of yourself in a smaller community when you get a little bit older. And so I wouldn't be frustrated by feeling like that your generation is complacent, because every generation at the age of high school and college feels the same way. And maybe Jill, you want to speak to that as a recent?
It's not even fair. Yeah, well, actually, I kind of wouldn't 100% agree that it's a complacent
I guess, generation that you and I are a part of. I feel like, yes, we have to strive to, do the best that we can be to get that talk, whatever we're after. But I do have a lot of friends who are interested in things like this. But this is one of those things where it's all anecdotal evidence, and there's no quantitative way to see if, our generation really is self-absorbed. Well, maybe Facebook. But anyways.
How many selfies do you guys take?
But anyways, I think one thing that you can strive to do that's really just a really easy thing, once a week, read an article about a different country that you don't know about, or once a month meet up with your friends and get to engage in a culture that you aren't surrounded by. And yes, it isn't directly related to genocide prevention, but it's the idea that diffusing any and all stereotypes or misunderstandings that there are between people at that very basic level, starting there, and then from there letting that mature and ferment into something greater.
One more plug for the non-complacent is I did have 5 great international studies interns for 2 quarters working with me to bring this series together. So, they could have done a lot of other internships and chose to hang in it to do this. So, yes, you.
I just had a question, because the video, a lot of the people were talking about that they want people to come in and save them and help. And you were talking about how Obama made promises when he was running to go and help in Darfur and in Sudan. I was just wondering what you thought the main reason was that no one came in, that the UN didn't come in to help. Did China really have that much power and say in order to stop people from coming in? Is it really just all about the oil?
Yeah, it's a good question. When you are an activist, always there's a lot of things that you wanted to do, but when you come to actual being in a position of power, then you are faced with different realities. Obviously, every decision has to pass through Security Council, and if all these nations, Sudan is a strong ally and friend of China. And always China would protect Sudan by all costs. So there are so many resolutions that were passed, but they never follow through in reality. One of them, Bashir is being indicted. There's a real seriousness to bring all these atrocities committed and bring Bashir to justice. But how do you arrest him? He's a head of state and he's being very powerful, backed by China. And every day he's continued to commit all these atrocities. So always this different way of when you are in the power because there's different players. It's not like as an activist you can bring an agenda and you can mobilize people around the cause, but getting to the realities, it's not. But we should not stop there, because we should, ask and strive for more. Because as a leader, and you something that you believe in it, like Obama, he can do more. Although there's some difficulties, there's other ways besides passing through the Security Council. He can make some executive decision to solve problems. And the other thing that I would add to is the complexity of the complication of these problems. In Sudan or South Sudan right now, with this conflict this broke out, where do you punish? This and it's not because of the system is missing there. These are new nations that were expected to build a nation out of scratch, and there's no institution. And where do they get the leader who is going to support them? And there's expectation for them to be a democratic nation. So even some country like Kenya were beaten. So that democracy always goes to the tribal angle. It doesn't go to the real sense of Western democracy. And if you push them hard to democracy, it's not going to work there. So there has to be a lot of things be put into consideration.
haven't had a question of, oh, good, there's one.
Wait, let's just ask them.
Oh, you want to ask? Okay, sorry. Here's
I
the
just wanted to say that it's not the case that the UN has done nothing. What it has done has not been terribly effective. And in some cases misguided, but and we can talk about this more at the reception, but I didn't want to leave the impression that the UN has done nothing.
Yes.
Well, one of you were talking about peace education that would be appropriate in the countries that are in turmoil. Now, not many of us can travel and do this abroad, but we live in a military environment here. We train our police officers, we train our soldiers to destroy. So what can we do as a peace educators here in this country to maybe shift the collective consciousness or individual consciousness? Because I'm overwhelmed with this. I don't know how to deal with all these atrocities. Help, please.
The only thing that I would offer, it piggybacks onto what I said earlier, know thy neighbor, and to know them is to be able to stand for them so that when something happens to them, you are also held accountable and you feel that sense of urgency to make sure that whatever it is that they're going through, whatever it is that they're going through, you're going through that too. And honestly, I mean, it's a really basic thing, but seriously, to know thy neighbor.
When I first started, when I was a student, I worked with Somali Bantu refugees in Portland, and one of my responsibilities was to go to this kindergarten class where there was these two Bantu children, and there was this one child in the class who was very disruptive, and the kindergarten teacher just didn't know how to deal with it. He was an American student, he wasn't the Bantu, but I was in the class because of the Bantu. And he was very chaotic, and he was sort of just like running around, sort of like my daughter does now, but just kind of like running around and causing chaos. And there was a young girl, his classmate, and it was time to sit on the mat and time for story time, for everybody to calm down, and he was running around like usual. And this girl tried to reel him in, I forget his name, he tried to go over and say, hey Joseph, like we're sitting on the mat, like come and the teacher said, don't talk to him, leave him alone, don't help him. And I thought, oh my God, we're teaching our children to not help one another, right? So this young girl, her instinct was to help draw him in, help calm him down, help him be part of the crowd, right? Help him, and that was the first realization to me that our education system, it doesn't naturally break down barriers, it doesn't naturally teach helping and sharing. And so the Little Ripples program that's in the refugee camps, the pillars are peace, helping and sharing. Peace particularly because in the refugee camps they use violence to get the kids to sit down. They swat them with a stick, and so it's the beginning of just the basics of nonviolence. But the idea that you share and you care and you help, just those fundamentals, just teaching the kids whose lives you're involved in and encouraging their character so when they do help another child or they do show caring, not just praising the action, like that was a nice thing to do, but saying like you're a really nice person for doing that. That kind of character encouragement will lead them to be better community members and look at our global community and our local community as equal.
I want to add a comment to that before we move on. There's a lot about trauma that's not just post-traumatic stress. There's vicarious trauma. There's the manifestations of just chronic stress. And the effects of that shows up in our nervous system that we tend to run on high, and we're not as calm, we're not as peaceful in that state. So when we talk about, how do we do that, shift of consciousness, I think from my perspective, one of the angles we're trying to work at is to help people learn how to actually, genuinely, within their body, come back into a state of calm, because that in and of itself opens up the mind to be able to think differently, to relate differently with others, to have a sense of being more sense of belonging within the whole, rather than feeling as threatened as we tend to get when we're running high on our fight-flight system all the time. So I think that's another component we need to increase. Okay, there was lots of hands. Yeah, go ahead, and then you're next, Donna.
So if I got it right, the for the student's case, the main criminals, the
pressure on the Chinese? Or
Do you mean the Sudanese or the southern Sudanese? Which conflict? Sorry, there's so many conflicts. Which?
well, there's the one that the Chinese are supporting. I don't know. The South Sudan?
Yeah.
I think she's talking about the Sudanese government.
Yeah, the Sudanese government. The Chinese has interest in oil. When the oil was discovered in 1999 in Sudan, mostly before it was an American company, Chevron, was the one who discovered the oil. But when the conflict started, because of moral issue, they have to leave. But China continued during the war, and they helped Sudan to extract oil and build pipeline. So China has a lot of investment in Sudan, and that's in order for them to keep that investment, they will have to block every any decision in the UN Security Council. Not only that, also because Sudan is one of the big countries with a lot of potential, and China doesn't want to leave Sudan, and China also selling arms to Sudan. So all of these weapons, they get it from China. Because Sudan was like under embargo, they can't buy it from any other where. And the United States have sanctioned against Sudan since '94 when they bombed the U.S. embassy. And that sanction is still in effect. But they have other ways to go and buy a weapon from China. And they also can use oil to buy it. And that's what happened during the civil war in South Sudan. The oil was extracted in South Sudan with money brought from China to kill the people there. So China has big interest.
so to put the pressure on China makes solve something? Because you can keep talking about
Yeah.
it, but we know the pressure has to be put on China.
Yes, but how do you do it? For example, like in the United States, Canada has a company, Talisman. There was called the Investment Act. People who have stocks with this company, they were told to, if the Canadians is going to support this brutal regime, people should withdraw their asset. They should invest from this company. But in China, you can't. There's no way that you can have that power to force the Chinese government not to do that because it's it's a different regime.
There have been various campaigns for us as Americans. So we're not going to affect the Chinese government because we're Americans, but we can put pressure on our own government to put pressure on China. But there are complications such as China owns the United States through debt. I mean, they really, to break it down, China really owns a lot of us, a lot of our business investments, but there's Investors Against Genocide is a great organization, and they really put pressure on investment companies to divest from companies who have any ties to China, which includes some Chinese companies. When they hosted the Olympics a few years ago, there was a lot of pressure. Steven Spielberg, Jewish, was supposed to choreograph the whole opening ceremonies, and there was a huge activist pressure on him saying, hey, look what China's doing, in Sudan. You can't put your artistic efforts behind that, and he pulled out. So there have been various efforts. Every time Clinton goes over there, Hillary Clinton goes over there to have her diplomatic meetings. Before she had this great text message number where you could text message her at 90822. They've disconnected that. I think probably because of the Sudanese activist community. But we have tried to put pressure on our own. Whenever Biden goes over there, we always do a campaign to target Biden. Hey, bring up Sudan, bring up the relations, and so we do put pressure on our own government to pressure China. And we have some team members on our team that are from Malaysia, and we have tried to kind of get into Chinese media. Our organization, one of the times that we were out in Sudan, out in refugee camps in Eastern Chad, did a live chat with this mom network of Chinese moms and trying to raise awareness within the mother community, kind of with the angle of mothers. So it's tough to get Chinese, but that is a really good way to stop their nice little cycle of buying oil, selling weapons, buying oil, selling weapons. And that would cut off the Sudanese government from a lot of cash, but it definitely is a tough thing for Americans to do, is influence Chinese policy.
We have about 60 seconds or so left. So I want to say something, and then I promised you a question, so we're going to have to give you a fast answer. But on your way out, don't leave yet, but on your way out, I want to point out that the Everyone Has a Name exhibit is leaning on that wall back there. And if you do want to fill out that survivor card that's in your program, if you want to write a little note of remembrance or your thoughts or how you were impacted, please feel free to do so. But that's where it will go. If you don't have time to pin it on, we can collect it and pin it for you. And I'm hoping many of you will also come to the reception directly after that and continue the dialogue with all four of our speakers here. Is your question long or short?